Freud, 1909, Little Hans. Background. Sigmund Freud was an Austrian neurologist, often known as the father of psychoanalysis due to his pioneering research in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Freud developed a theory called psychosexual development to describe how people develop through life in 5 separate stages. The first stage is the oral stage, which occurs from birth to 1 year. The second stage is the anal stage, from 1 year to 3 years. The third stage is the phallic stage, occurring from 3 years to 5 or 6 years. The fourth is the latency stage, occurring from 5 or 6 years to puberty, and the final is the fifth stage, the genital stage, from puberty to adulthood. Freud's theory encompasses both nature and nurture, and includes the idea that the unconscious mind determines much of our behavior, and that we are motivated by unconscious emotional drives. He proposed that the adult personality has 3 parts: the id, the ego, and the superego. The id, or ID, consists of pleasure-seeking desires, which we are all born with. The ego develops later in childhood and controls the desires of the id, or ID. The superego is the moralistic part of the personality, which develops as a child interacts with others, such as their parents. The superego can be regarded as the conscious, while the ID is the unconscious, and the role of the ego is to maintain a balance between the unconscious id and the conscious superego. Freud believed that the unconscious contains unresolved conflicts and has a powerful effect on our behavior and experience. He argued that many of these conflicts will show up in our fantasies and dreams, but that the conflicts are also threatening, so they appear disguised in symbolic forms. Specifically, Freud believes that during the phallic stage, children develop an Oedipus complex, which refers to an unconscious sexual desire towards the opposite sex parent, i.e. the mother if the child is a boy, or the father if the child is a girl. According to Freud, the complex manifests itself differently amongst boys and girls. For boys, it manifests as castration anxiety, or the fear of losing their genitalia, whereas for girls, it manifests as penis envy, whereby they resent not possessing male genitalia. Freud's theory said that children must successfully resolve the Oedipus complex during the phallic stage, and that failure to do so properly may result in neurosis. In order to further develop and test his theory, Freud decided to conduct a case study of one of his psychoanalysis patients, a young boy between the ages of 3 and 5 years old. The patient's real name was changed to Little Hans for the purpose of the study, to help ensure anonymity. According to Hans's father, who had been documenting the behavior, he had developed a phobia of horses when he was 3 years old, and Freud decided to investigate this. Aim. Freud wanted to investigate the case of Little Hans to understand why he had developed his phobia of horses. He also wanted to gather evidence to support his psychoanalytic theory, and in particular, the phallic stage of the psychosexual development. Sample. The study consisted of only 1 participant. At the time, Hans and his family lived in Austria, and he was recruited to Freud's study because he was already one of his patients. Little Hans was a 5-year-old during the study. However, his father had been documenting his behavior since age 3. Methodology. The study of Little Hans is considered a longitudinal case study, however it also does contain some elements of observation and interviews. Freud never actually met Little Hans or his father in person during the study. Instead, Hans's father wrote many letters to Freud documenting Hans's behavior, which he had observed, and he had also asked Hans questions about his thoughts and behavior. Hans's father was already a supporter of Freud's theories before the study took place. Procedure. When Little Hans was around 3 years old, he began to develop an interest in his genitals, and would occasionally touch them in the presence of others, which caused his mother to wearily threaten to call a doctor to cut it off. At around 3.5 years old, Hans gained a baby sister named Hannah, who he disliked, and, according to Freud, wished that his mother would drop her in the bath so she would drown, and so that he could have his mother's full attention. Hans and his family lived opposite a building, which was very often busy with horse-drawn coaches. Hans developed a phobia of white horses, which according to his father and Freud seemed to stem from 2 incidents. Hans had overheard a man, other than his father, telling another child not to put their fingers near the horse or they would bite them. And Hans also witnessed a horse fall down while pushing a coach and kick its legs before dying in the street. From then on, his fear was apparently generalized to coaches as well as horses. In particular, Freud noted that Hans reported having particular fears of horses that had black bits around their mouths and blinkers over their eyes. Both Hans's father and Freud strongly believed that he had a fear of these horses in particular because they were a symbol of his father, who had a mustache and spectacles. Hans's father also reported an exchange to Freud that had occurred between Hans and himself, which ended with Hans saying, "Daddy, don't trot away from me." In addition, prior to the development of his horse phobia, Hans had been anxious that his mother would leave him. He was also prone to fantasies and daydreams. Hans told his father about a fantasy involving two giraffes. One was big, while the other was crumpled. Freud suggested that the bigger giraffe was an unconscious representation of Hans's father, while the crumpled giraffe represented his mother. During the fantasy, Hans led the crumpled giraffe away from the big one, which caused the big one to complain, and then Hans sat atop the crumpled giraffe. Hans also had two fantasies which featured two plumbers. During the first fantasy, Hans was in the bath and the plumber came into the room and unscrewed the bath. The plumber then took a borer, which is similar to a corkscrew, and stuck it into Hans' stomach. The second plumber fantasy involved a plumber using a pair of pliers to remove Hans's backside, and his, quote, whittler, which was the name he used to refer to his penis. The plumber then replaced Hans's backside and whittler with bigger versions. A third fantasy involved Hans being married to his own mother with children, but where his father was now his grandfather rather than his father. Freud suggested that this was clear evidence of the Oedipus complex manifesting in Hans's fantasies. After receiving help from Freud to resolve his Oedipus complex, the study of little Hans came to an end. Results. After compiling and reviewing all of the correspondence between himself and Hans's father, Freud offered explanations about why Hans developed his phobia of horses and an Oedipus complex. Freud saw Hans's phobia as an unconscious manifestation of the Oedipus complex. According to Freud, Hans was scared that his father would castrate him for desiring his mother, and he would project this fear onto horses since they reminded Hans of his father. Freud suggested that Hans feared the horses would castrate him by biting him as punishment for his incestuous desires towards his mother. Freud postulated that the phobia had begun as an Oedipal conflict regarding Hans being allowed into his parents' bed in the morning, which his father objected to. Freud and Hans's father interpreted Hans's fantasy about the giraffes as being a representation of the morning exchanges in his parents' bed. The big giraffe calling out represented Hans's father objecting to Hans taking the crumpled giraffe, his mother, away. The explanations offered by Freud sought to demonstrate how the Oedipus complex manifests itself during the phallic stage of the psychosexual development, which all boys go through between the ages of 3 and 6 years old. According to Freud's theory, the complex is characterized by an intense sexual love for the boy's mother, and the development of a fear that the boy's father will castrate them as a rival for their mother's attention. The fantasies that Hans developed were a coping mechanism that he used to cope with the threat of being castrated, whereby he identified with the aggressor by adopting his father's mannerisms, attitudes, and actions, thinking that if his father regarded him as similar, then he would not feel hostile towards him, and therefore not want to castrate him. Freud concluded that the Oedipus complex developed by little Hans was resolved once he started fantasizing about having a larger whittler like his father, and being married to his mother, with his father's role changed to that of a grandfather. Hans's father reported that Hans did ultimately recover from his phobia after he assured Hans, after Freud's suggestion, that he did not intend to castrate him. Conclusions. Freud concluded that the information gathered during the case study of little Hans supported his theory of psychosexual development, particularly in the occurrence of the Oedipus complex during the phallic stage. He further concluded that the study provided evidence to support his theory that phobias are products of unconscious anxiety that is projected onto external objects that are unrelated, such as horses being a representation of Hans's father. Freud also concluded that the case study supported the concept of unconscious determinism, whereby people are not consciously aware of what causes their behavior. Lastly, Freud concluded that the study proved that his psychoanalytical therapy was a valid approach to treating people with, quote, disturbed thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, by identifying the unconscious causes of disturbances and then discussing them consciously so they could be resolved. Evaluations. Perhaps the main limitation of Freud's research was that it was based entirely on anecdotal evidence with no quantitative data produced. This means that it was unfalsifiable and not repeatable, which therefore reduces its validity. Moreover, one of Freud's aims in conducting the study was to prove his own theories were correct. He conducted all of the analysis for little Hans himself, which was very subjective, based on only qualitative data, and the data was all gathered by Hans's father, who was a supporter of Freud's research and theories, which could have led to researcher bias. The study sample consisted of only one participant, which means that it's difficult to generalize the results to other children, since we cannot know whether all children have similar experiences based on just one anecdotal case. The case study of little Hans was arguably very useful, however, since it's one of the first psychological studies that investigated the relationship between the unconscious and conscious human mind within the psychodynamic perspective, forming the bias of all subsequent studies and approaches in psychology. The study collected a lot of qualitative data, which is very descriptive and provided Freud with a lot of rich data about little Hans's discussions and about his phobias and fantasies. Little Hans may have found the questioning a little uncomfortable at times, and his consent to take part in the study was provided on his behalf by his father. However, overall, he was not subject to any significant psychological harm. So, on balance, the study can be considered ethical. It can be